The room was still, almost unnaturally quiet, the kind of silence that made the air feel heavy and thick. A single envelope lay on the polished mahogany desk before Prince William, its crisp white paper standing out starkly against the dark wood. No royal crest, no ceremonial ribbon, just a plain, unmarked envelope. Yet the weight it carried was immeasurable. His hands hovered above it, trembling ever so slightly, as if the paper itself might burn him. He knew what was inside. He knew that opening it could tear apart the very foundations of his life, the monarchy, and the image of stability that the world had been led to believe in for decades. But what he didn't know, what he couldn't yet fathom, was just how deep the truth would cut. It had started innocuously enough, months earlier, with a request cloaked in the language of health and family. A routine genealogical check, they had called it, spurred by the idea of preserving royal medical records for future generations. There had been no suspicion, no indication that this was anything more than another duty he was expected to fulfill. But somewhere between the labs, the analysis, and the discreet communications, the request had taken on a different life. The tone in the messages from the private medical team had shifted, becoming colder, more clinical, and above all, more cautious. They had begun asking questions he wasn't used to hearing, questions about parentage and historical records, questions that hinted at something far more personal than any medical precaution. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. William had been raised in a world where secrecy was second nature, where appearances mattered more than truth, and where family loyalty often meant swallowing your own questions. From the moment he was old enough to understand the gravity of his position, he was taught that certain topics were off-limits, sealed behind closed doors, never to be spoken aloud. But this was different. This was science. And science, unlike whispers in the corridors of palaces, left no room for ambiguity. The night before the envelope arrived, he'd barely slept. His mind replayed the moments of his life, not in the order they had happened, but in the order they now demanded to be remembered. The long summers at Highgrove, his mother's warm embrace, his father's distant but steady presence, the first time he met Camilla as a boy, awkward, polite, his mother's eyes watching carefully from across the room. These fragments, once innocuous, now pulsed with an unease he couldn't quite name. They seemed sharper, louder, more vivid, as if they were trying to tell him something he had failed to hear the first time. And then there was that one conversation. He hadn't thought of it in years. It was late one evening, and he'd overheard raised voices drifting down the long hall of Kensington Palace. His mother, Diana, was speaking with someone, her tone edged with steel, but also with hurt. He had caught only a few words before footsteps approached, and he was ushered away by a member of staff. At the time, he thought nothing of it. Arguments between adults were part of life. But now, as he sat before the envelope, the memory returned unbidden, carrying with it a chilling sense of relevance. When the envelope was delivered that morning, it was handed to him directly by his personal aide. No fanfare, no explanation, just the quiet weight of something irreversible. He had dismissed everyone from the room, closed the door, and sat there for what felt like hours, staring at it. His life until now had been defined by certainty, or at least the illusion of it. The idea that his parentage could be anything other than what the world believed was unthinkable. And yet, here he was, moments away from possibly dismantling that belief. This was not just about him. It was about the monarchy itself, the centuries-old institution built on lineage, tradition, and the unbroken line of succession. If the results inside that envelope said what he feared they might, the implications would be seismic. The press would feast on it. Politicians would use it. Enemies of the crown would seize it as an opportunity to weaken Britain's most enduring symbol. But perhaps worst of all, it would mean that the life he had lived, the sacrifices he had made, and the identity he had carried were based on a story that was never true. He thought of his children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, and what this could mean for them. They were still young, still blissfully untouched by the complexities of royal politics. But the truth had a way of spilling over, of finding its way into every corner of a family's life. One day, they would ask questions, and he would need to decide whether to answer them with the version of events the palace might want him to tell, or with the truth that had been kept from him for decades. William's mind wandered briefly to the public image of his parents, his official father, King Charles, and his late mother, Diana. He recalled the warm, carefully choreographed photographs, the ceremonial appearances, the way the media once portrayed them as a fairy tale couple before the cracks began to show. He remembered the pain of his parents' very public separation, the way Diana had opened her heart in interviews while Charles retreated into the guarded language of a man bred to hide emotion. And then there was Camilla, the woman once vilified in the press, now queen, her presence in his life redefined by decades of complicated history. He had accepted her in the public role she now played, even built a cordial relationship. But what if that relationship was something entirely different? What if the bond between them was not political or ceremonial, but biological? His pulse quickened. It was absurd, he told himself. The notion that Charles and Camilla could both be his biological parents made no sense in the official timeline. But then again, official timelines were curated things, crafted by palace staff and public relations teams. He had seen firsthand how the narrative could be shaped, how inconvenient facts could be buried beneath layers of protocol and tradition. The question wasn't whether it was possible. The question was whether it was true. He rose from his chair, pacing the length of the room, his mind pulling apart every moment he could remember involving Camilla. There were the subtle gestures, the knowing smiles, the quiet moments when she seemed to be watching him with an expression he couldn't quite place. At the time, he had taken it as polite regard, the awkwardness of two people finding their footing in a blended royal family. Now, each glance felt loaded, each smile reframed in the harsh light of suspicion. The sound of a clock chiming pulled him from his thoughts. Time was passing, and the envelope remained sealed. Somewhere beyond the walls of this room, the palace went about its daily business. Meetings, briefings, public appearances, all oblivious to the truth poised to detonate within these four walls. He could almost hear the muffled sounds of staff moving about, their lives untouched by the storm that was about to break over his. Taking a deep breath, he sat again, the envelope before him. His fingers brushed against the paper, feeling its smooth surface, the faint texture of the adhesive flap. He knew that once he opened it, there would be no going back. The truth, once revealed, could not be forgotten, could not be neatly put away like an unwanted gift. It would live in his mind, coloring every memory, every interaction, every decision from this moment on. He hesitated one last time, his thoughts turning to the possibility that maybe, just maybe, it was better not to know. But the thought was fleeting. Whatever was inside, it was his right to see it, his duty to face it. And so, with hands that no longer trembled but were heavy with resolve, he slid a finger beneath the flap and began to tear it open. The paper tore with a faint, deliberate rip, a sound far louder in his ears than it could possibly be in reality. It was as if each fiber being pulled apart was snapping some invisible thread that had held his life together until now. He removed the folded document from within, its weight deceptively light for something that could crush him. For a moment, he didn't look at the words. He stared at the thin black lines of text, as though they might rearrange themselves into something less dangerous if he waited long enough. But they didn't. The truth was already there, staring back at him, indifferent to the consequences it carried. His eyes began to trace the lines, and almost immediately his breath hitched. The language was clinical, precise, without flourish or emotion, but every syllable landed like a blow. The report confirmed a genetic relationship that defied the official history, one that could not be explained away by clerical error or scientific anomaly. It stated plainly, without hesitation, that his biological parents were King Charles and Camilla. His pulse thundered in his ears. For a long time, he couldn't breathe. In the space of a few sentences, decades of his life twisted into something unrecognizable. The childhood memories he had once clung to for comfort now stood on unsteady ground. His mother's voice, her laugh, her embrace, were they echoes of a woman he had believed to be his mother but who, according to this document, had no biological link to him? He felt an aching guilt even letting the thought form. Diana had been everything to him, more than just a mother. She had been his protector, his champion, the one who shielded him from the cold machinery of royal life. That bond was real, unshakable, yet the report seemed to insist that it had been built on a hidden truth. His first instinct was disbelief. There had to be a mistake. This had to be the work of someone with an agenda, someone who wanted to destabilize him, the monarchy, maybe even Britain itself. But as he read further, the document cited multiple, independent verifications. The methods used, the chain of custody for the samples, it was all airtight. If this was a fabrication, it was the most sophisticated deception he had ever seen. Still, the question burned in his mind. Why now? Who had set this chain of events in motion? And who else knew? He thought of the eyes that would inevitably turn toward him if this information went public. Every handshake, every speech, every visit to a hospital or school would be seen through a different lens. The media would explode with speculation. Old photographs of Charles and Camilla from decades ago would resurface, examined in microscopic detail for signs of intimacy before the world thought it began. Every move he made would be picked apart, every facial expression interpreted as confirmation or denial. The deeper he thought, the more he realized how carefully such a truth must have been guarded. If it was real, it meant an elaborate network of silence had existed for years, decades even, encompassing aides, doctors, maybe even politicians. It was a secret with the potential to unravel more than just his personal life. It could fracture the very structure of the royal family. Succession, legitimacy, the symbolic continuity of the crown, all of it could be thrown into chaos. The monarchy had survived wars, abdications, divorces, but this was different. This was the kind of truth that burrowed into the public consciousness and stayed there, reshaping how the nation saw its rulers forever. He set the paper down, but its words burned in his mind. He rose again, pacing the length of the room, trying to summon some clarity. His training as a future king had taught him to compartmentalize emotion, to process quietly before acting. But this wasn't a matter of diplomacy or policy. This was his life, his identity, and there was no diplomatic language for that. The people who had raised him, guided him, shaped him into the man the world saw. Were they the people he thought they were? Or had his entire existence been framed by a lie so monumental it required an institution to maintain it? The thought of confronting Charles made his chest tighten. He tried to picture how such a conversation might go. Would Charles admit it? Would he deny it and dismiss the report as slander? Or worse, would he sidestep entirely, offering the kind of non-answer only someone born into royalty could deliver? William wasn't sure which possibility frightened him more. And then there was Camilla. In public, their relationship was one of measured politeness, occasionally warm, but never overtly sentimental. If the report was true, she had watched him grow up carrying this secret, smiling at him in public while hiding a truth that would change everything between them. He sat again, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees, pressing his hands to his face. A part of him wanted to tear the document to shreds, to pretend it never existed. If he destroyed it, maybe the truth could remain locked away where it had been for so long. But another part of him, the part that valued honesty, transparency, and the sense of duty he had carried all his life, knew that such a choice would eat away at him. Lies were heavy things, and carrying them for too long could break even the strongest back. The sound of laughter drifted faintly through the windows from the gardens outside. Staff members were preparing for a small public engagement that afternoon, and the noise was a reminder of the world beyond his walls, a world that still saw him as the confident, composed Prince William. They had no idea that in this moment, that man was crumbling, replaced by someone unsure of his place in the story he had been told. The light in the room had shifted while he sat there, the soft morning glow giving way to the sharper midday sun. Time was moving forward, indifferent to the crisis unfolding inside him. He glanced back at the envelope, now lying open and harmless looking on the desk. But it wasn't harmless. It was a blade, and it had cut through the life he thought he knew. Whatever came next, he understood one thing with absolute certainty. Nothing would ever be the same again. He rose slowly, the decision forming in his mind. The report could not be ignored. It demanded answers, and those answers would not be found in a piece of paper. They would be found in the voices of the two people named within it, the king and the queen. He would have to face them, and in doing so, face the truth of who he really was. The room had not changed in the hours since the envelope had been placed on the desk, yet the air inside felt heavier, as though the weight of what it contained had altered the atmosphere itself. The curtains were drawn just enough to let in muted daylight, casting a pale glow across the polished wood and the leather-bound volumes lining the shelves. This was William's private sanctuary, a place meant for quiet reflection and strategy, but today it was a prison. Every time his eyes drifted to the white rectangle lying at the center of the desk, it seemed to grow in presence, as though it was watching him rather than the other way around. He had been summoned to this room by an instinct he didn't fully understand. It wasn't as though the letter had arrived with any urgency. There had been no pounding on the door, no whispered warning from a staff member. The delivery had been painfully ordinary. Yet from the moment he saw it in his aide's hand, he knew it demanded his immediate attention. It wasn't marked with any official royal insignia, and that alone was unsettling. Everything in his life came stamped, sealed, documented, and recorded. An unmarked envelope was not just unusual, it was alarming. William sat back in his chair, leaning slightly forward with his elbows on the armrests, his hands clasped under his chin. His breathing was measured but shallow, the kind of controlled rhythm one adopts when preparing to face something irreversible. The stillness was punctuated only by the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. He found himself counting the seconds between ticks, as though the steady beat could anchor him to a moment that was rapidly slipping away. This wasn't the first time he had received unsettling correspondence, but it was the first time he had been warned, albeit indirectly, about the nature of its contents. Weeks earlier, a private conversation with a trusted confidant had left him unsettled. They had spoken of things most people would dismiss as idle gossip, rumors about timelines, whispers about relationships that predated the public record, inconsistencies in certain accounts of the past. William had brushed it off at the time. The royal family had lived with rumors for centuries. But the look in his confidant's eyes was different. It wasn't speculation. It was knowledge. Now, here he was, staring at the physical manifestation of that unspoken truth. The envelope contained the results of a genetic test, one he hadn't personally ordered but had consented to as part of a seemingly harmless request about updating royal medical records. He had been told it was important for historical archives and for the health of future generations. It had sounded noble, responsible. He had not anticipated that such a request could unravel everything he thought he knew about his life. He reached for the envelope once, then drew his hand back. His mind was flooded with memories of the countless briefings he had endured on handling sensitive information. Always maintain composure. Always consider the wider implications. Always remember the duty to the crown. But how did one apply such rules to something that struck at the very core of personal identity? This wasn't about a political scandal or a diplomatic mishap. This was about blood, lineage, and the truth that could redefine his entire existence. His thoughts wandered to Diana. Her absence was a wound that never truly healed, but in moments like this, it throbbed with fresh pain. She had been his moral compass, the one person who encouraged him to see beyond the gilded cage of royalty. If she were here, what would she say? Would she tell him to open it immediately, to face whatever truth lay inside with courage? Or would she urge him to protect himself from a pain that might be too great to bear? He could almost hear her voice in his mind, the way she used to speak to him when he was a boy, calm, soothing, yet firm in her belief that he could handle anything life threw his way. The longer he sat, the more his mind drew connections he had never allowed himself to make before. The way Camilla had sometimes looked at him, not with the stiffness of a stepmother maintaining distance, but with something softer, almost knowing. The way certain members of the household had treated him in his younger years, as though they were privy to some private joke or secret. Even moments with Charles began to replay in a different light, the rare flashes of pride, the times he seemed more invested in William's path than in his own public image. Could it be that all of these fragments were pieces of a puzzle he had never been allowed to see until now? William rose from his chair and began pacing. Movement helped him think, but it also made the envelope seem to follow him, its presence magnetic. He thought of the public, how they viewed him, how they had watched him grow from a young prince into a man destined for the throne. They saw him as the future of the monarchy, the stable counterpoint to his brother's turbulence. But what would they think if the foundation of that future was shaken by a truth as personal as this? How would the people react if the man they had placed their hopes in was not the son of the fairy tale marriage they had once celebrated, but the product of a hidden relationship buried beneath decades of palace control. The questions kept multiplying, each one heavier than the last. Did the queen know? Not Camilla, the late Queen Elizabeth. She had been the embodiment of discretion, a woman who carried the weight of state secrets and personal grief with the same unflinching grace. If she had known this truth, she had taken it to her grave. That thought alone made William's chest tighten. The idea that such a fundamental fact about his life could have been known and kept from him by someone he loved and respected was almost as painful as the possibility of the truth itself. He stopped pacing and stood before the desk once more. His fingers rested on the envelope, feeling the faint texture of the paper beneath his touch. He had been trained for years to act with deliberation, to avoid rash decisions. But this felt different. This wasn't a decision he could plan for weeks in advance. It was a choice between ignorance and knowledge, between the safety of the familiar lie and the dangerous clarity of truth. The clock in the corner ticked again, and this time it sounded like a drumbeat, urging him forward. His breathing deepened, his shoulders squared. He had faced crises before, public scrutiny, family scandals, national tragedies, but none of them had been this intimate, this personal. He knew that the moment he broke the seal, there would be no undoing it. The words inside would alter not just his perception of the past, but the trajectory of his future. As his hand slid under the flap, he felt a strange calm wash over him. Whatever was written inside, it was already reality. Opening it would not create the truth, it would simply reveal it. And as much as he feared what he might find, he understood that leadership, whether over a family or a nation, demanded the courage to face what others might run from. When the flap gave way and the envelope opened, it was with a quiet finality. He had not yet unfolded the papers, but in that moment, he knew that the act of opening it had already changed him. The man who had walked into the room was not the man who would walk out. For most of his life, William had lived with the knowledge that his family history was not just his own, but belonged to the world. Every milestone, every fracture, every moment of warmth or scandal had been documented, scrutinized, dissected by the press and the public. He was no stranger to the fact that the British royal family's narrative was as much a work of curation as it was a matter of bloodlines. But knowing this in an abstract sense and confronting it in a way that threatened to reshape his very identity were two vastly different realities. The story the world had been told was simple enough. Prince Charles, heir to the throne, had married Lady Diana Spencer in a ceremony that captured global attention in 1981. They had two sons, William and Harry, before their marriage dissolved in a blaze of tabloid headlines. It was a tale that had been framed as both romantic and tragic, a modern fairy tale undone by human flaws. But beneath the glossy surface, there had always been shadows, whispers of other affections, of private meetings, of relationships that stretched far beyond the timelines the public had been given. William had grown up aware, to some degree, of his father's long-standing connection with Camilla Parker Bowles. Even before the media openly acknowledged her as Charles's great love, she was a presence in his life. At first, she existed on the periphery. Her name spoken in guarded tones, her appearances at public events carefully managed. Then, over the years, she became a fixture. By the time she married his father, William had already learned the skill of compartmentalization. Publicly, he smiled and accepted her as part of the family. Privately, he kept her at a polite but deliberate distance. But there were moments, fleeting, subtle, that made him wonder if there was more to their connection than mere cordiality. A lingering look across a room, an unexpected softness in her voice when she addressed him, the way her gaze sometimes seemed to search his face as if reading something only she could see. At the time, he had chalked it up to her effort to bridge the gap between them, to ease the awkwardness that came with her role in the family. Now, in the wake of the envelope's revelation, those moments took on a different shape. He began to recall the early days after Diana's death, when the world had turned its mourning into an endless cycle of images and commentary. Camilla had been largely absent from the public narrative then, but she had been present in quieter ways. He remembered a visit to Highgrove when he was still reeling from grief. She had been there, moving through the house with an air of restraint, speaking to him in a tone that was neither intrusive nor overly formal. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it. Now, he wondered what was behind that measured care. The history between Charles and Camilla was no secret. Their relationship had roots that reached back to the early 1970s, long before Diana entered the picture. They had been in love once, or so the story went. But timing, obligations, and the rigid expectations of the monarchy had pushed them apart. Charles had gone on to marry Diana. Camilla had married Andrew Parker Bowles. Yet the connection between them endured, surviving years of public denial, scandal, and scrutiny. When they eventually married in 2005, it was framed as a love story that had overcome decades of obstacles. But for William, it was always a complicated truth, one that sat uneasily beside the narrative of his own childhood. As he thought back over the years, certain inconsistencies began to surface in his memory, dates that didn't quite align. Family events where Camilla's presence seemed oddly natural, even before the public was aware of her importance to Charles. Conversations he had overheard between staff members when he was a teenager, conversations that stopped abruptly the moment he entered the room. The whispers had always been there, buried in the rhythm of palace life. There had been other, stranger signs as well, things he had ignored because they seemed too vague to matter. A comment from a distant relative about how much he looked like someone in Camilla's family. An awkward silence in a meeting when someone inadvertently mentioned an old trip his father had taken in the months before his birth. Even the way certain royal insiders treated him, with a mix of deference and something else, something harder to name, but which now, in hindsight, felt almost like guarded knowledge. The monarchy had weathered worse than rumors of affairs, but questions about parentage were another matter entirely. In the history of the British crown, bloodlines had determined everything: inheritance, titles, legitimacy. A monarch's claim to the throne was not just a matter of public perception. It was codified in centuries of tradition and law. If the whispers were true, if the test results were accurate, then William's position in that line was not what the world believed. That was more than a personal scandal. It was a potential constitutional crisis. Yet, despite the enormity of what he was considering, there was an odd sense of clarity forming in his mind. The pieces fit together in ways they never had before. The rumors of his father's enduring connection to Camilla, the gaps in public timelines, the guarded way palace staff sometimes spoke around him. All of it pointed to the possibility that the life he had been told was his from birth was, in fact, something else entirely. It struck him that if this truth had been hidden for decades, it could not have been done by accident. It would have required deliberate choices, coordinated efforts, and a loyalty among those who knew that went beyond duty. It bordered on conspiracy. And if that were the case, then this was not just a matter between him and his parents. It was a secret that implicated an entire network of people within the monarchy, people who had likely lied to his face countless times while ensuring the facade remained intact. The realization made him feel suddenly isolated. He thought of his brother, Harry, and wondered if he had ever sensed anything. Harry had always been more vocal about the constraints of royal life, more willing to challenge the institution that had shaped them. If he had suspected such a truth, would he have said something? Or would he have kept it to himself, knowing the chaos it could unleash? William found himself staring at a photograph on the desk, a formal portrait of him and his family, taken the previous year. Kate stood beside him, their children arranged in front. It was the kind of image meant to project stability, legacy, and continuity. Yet now it felt like a carefully constructed stage set, one that could collapse with a single gust of truth. The irony was not lost on him. The future of the monarchy, the image of its stability, had been resting on a foundation that might not even exist. The more he considered the family history, the more he saw how fragile the official narrative really was. It was a reminder that behind every public ceremony, every balcony wave, and every carefully worded statement, there was a private world built on decisions the public would never fully understand. He was beginning to see that his own life had been shaped not just by those decisions, but by the unspoken agreements and silences that surrounded them. And as he sat there, piecing together the patterns from years of half-memories and subtle signs, he realized that the whispers had never truly been background noise. They had been warnings, if only he had been willing to listen. The memory had been buried for years, tucked away in the back of William's mind like an old photograph that was too painful to look at but impossible to throw away. It had happened when he was still a boy, no more than 10 or 11, during a winter evening in Kensington Palace. The corridors were dimly lit, the kind of subdued lighting the palace often took on after formal dinners, when the staff's footsteps grew quieter and the air seemed thick with unspoken tension. He had been on his way to his room, carrying a book his mother had given him earlier that day, when the sound of raised voices stopped him in his tracks. At first, he thought it might be a conversation between members of the staff. Heated exchanges were not uncommon behind closed doors, though they rarely lasted long. But as he listened, the voices were unmistakable, his mother's and his father's. Diana's tone was sharp, almost brittle, the kind of voice she used when she was holding back anger but couldn't completely mask it. Charles's voice was lower, steadier, but laced with something William didn't have the vocabulary for back then. Now, as an adult, he recognized it as a mix of defensiveness and guilt. He moved closer, standing in the shadow of a half-open door at the end of the hall. The words were muffled, but fragments carried through. He caught his mother saying something about lies and about promises that had been broken long before she had been told the truth. His father's reply was quieter, almost pleading, but then Diana's voice rose again, sharper this time, cutting through the stillness. He deserves to know one day. You can't hide it forever. Before William could piece together what she meant, there was a pause, followed by the sound of footsteps approaching the doorway. His heart leapt, and he quickly ducked into a side corridor, pressing his back to the wall until the steps faded away. He never found out what happened next, because by the time he dared to return to that hallway, the door was closed, the voices gone, and the air thick with the kind of silence that made you feel as though something irreversible had been set in motion. That night, lying in bed, the conversation replayed in his mind. He didn't understand the full meaning, but he understood enough to know that whatever his mother was talking about, it was important. Over the years, he tried to dismiss it, to convince himself it had been about something unrelated to him. But the tone in her voice, the urgency, the rawness, had stayed with him. It was the kind of memory that didn't fade with time. Instead, it grew heavier, gathering meaning as the years passed, and as he learned more about the complexities of his parents' marriage. Now, with the DNA results in his possession, that night came flooding back with painful clarity. Diana's words made sense in a way they never had before. The he she had spoken of was not a hypothetical figure in some distant dispute. She had been talking about him. She had been warning Charles that the truth would one day have to be told. It was chilling to realize that she had been right, though not in the way she might have imagined. The truth hadn't been told. It had been delivered in the sterile language of a laboratory report, decades after that conversation. The more he thought about it, the more other memories began to surface, small, seemingly insignificant moments that now felt like pieces of a much larger puzzle. There was the time he had walked into a room and found his mother staring out the window, her face pale, her hands gripping the curtains tightly. When he had asked if she was all right, she had smiled and said she was just thinking, but her eyes told a different story. Then there were the times Charles had gone out of his way to praise him in public, often more warmly than he did with Harry. At the time, William had taken it as encouragement, but now he wondered if it had been something else, an attempt to quietly acknowledge a truth that could never be spoken aloud. He remembered, too, a day at Highgrove when Camilla had been present for a private lunch. He had been younger then, still adjusting to her presence in his father's life. She had made a passing comment about how much he had grown and how he had his father's eyes. It had struck him as an odd thing to say, not because it wasn't true, but because of the way she said it, softly, almost wistfully, as though she were speaking to herself rather than to him. He had brushed it off at the time, but now, in light of everything, the memory unsettled him. What troubled him most was the realization that if Diana had known, she had carried that knowledge alone. She had lived with it while raising him, protecting him, and shaping him into the man the public saw. It explained certain looks she gave him when the subject of his father came up, looks that had seemed to hold both love and sorrow. She had always been fiercely protective of him and Harry, but with him, there had been an extra layer to that protection, something he couldn't name until now. The palace was full of ghosts, not in the literal sense, but in the form of these lingering memories, each tied to an unspoken truth. They hid in the walls, in the corners of photographs, in the moments when the cameras weren't rolling. As William sat in his study, the weight of these recollections pressed down on him, making the air feel thinner. He understood now that the night he overheard his parents' argument was the night his childhood began to shift, even if he hadn't realized it at the time. It was the first crack in the foundation of the story he had been told about himself. He pushed back from the desk and walked to the window, looking out at the palace gardens. The winter sun was low, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns. Somewhere out there, gardeners moved methodically through their work, oblivious to the storm brewing inside these walls. He envied their ignorance. They didn't have to wonder whether their entire identity was built on a lie. As he stood there, he made a silent promise to himself. Whatever this truth turned out to mean for his future, he would not bury it the way it had been buried from him. If his mother's voice had been right that night, that he deserved to know, then his children would deserve the same honesty from him. That, at least, he could control, even if he could control nothing else about the whirlwind that was beginning to consume his life. The request had seemed harmless enough when it first reached William's attention. It had come during a quiet afternoon in his private office, buried among the usual stack of correspondence that mixed public engagements, policy briefings, and family matters. The letter had been on discreet stationery, bearing the seal of a private medical institute the royal family had occasionally used for specialized consultations. The language was polite, clinical, and framed in the kind of professional detachment that gave no hint of the storm it would set in motion. The proposal was straightforward on the surface, a comprehensive genetic health screening for senior members of the royal family, aimed at preserving accurate medical records for future generations. It was, the letter suggested, part of an initiative to support public awareness around hereditary health risks and the importance of proactive screening. The idea was that the results could be anonymized and later used in public campaigns to encourage people across the country to take similar steps. William had been told his participation would help set an example. He had not questioned it at first. The monarchy had long been involved in health awareness causes, and this request seemed perfectly aligned with that tradition. His initial reaction had been one of dutiful compliance. The letter asked for a simple appointment, handled by a private medical team, with assurances of absolute confidentiality. There was nothing in its wording to suggest that this would be anything other than routine. But looking back now, he could see the subtle signs that something was different. The first was the way the request had bypassed the usual channels. Normally, such matters would be discussed first with his private secretary, then coordinated through palace medical advisors. This time, the letter had been handed directly to him by a courier, with no explanation for the deviation from protocol. The second was the timing. It had arrived just days after a brief but tense exchange with one of his father's oldest aides, a man who rarely spoke directly to William unless it was absolutely necessary. At the time, these details had barely registered. The days that followed were filled with public engagements, meetings, and the usual demands of balancing his official duties with his family life. The appointment was scheduled for a weekend, in a private wing of a well-respected London clinic. Kate had encouraged him to go through with it, reminding him that genetic information could be important for their children's health. He had agreed, viewing it as an obligation more than anything else. The process itself had been unremarkable. A series of vials of blood were drawn, along with a standard cheek swab. The clinicians were polite, professional, and gave no indication that anything unusual was at play. There were no strange questions, no prying into personal history, just the efficient gathering of samples and the reassurance that results would be sent to him directly in sealed form. It was only later, after the samples had been taken, that small inconsistencies began to nag at him. He realized he had not signed the usual consent forms specifying how his data would be used. The medical team had brought their own documentation, already signed off by an unnamed, authorizing party. When he asked about it, they told him it was standard procedure for royal consultations, a claim he knew wasn't true. Still, he let it pass. Weeks went by without any word, and the matter slipped to the back of his mind. It was during this period that the first anonymous message reached him. It was a short, typed note delivered without a return address, placed among his personal mail. The message was cryptic. "You will receive results you didn't ask for. Be prepared." There was no signature, no indication of who had sent it. He had shown it to no one, not even Kate. Something about the starkness of the message had made him instinctively protective of it. as if sharing it would somehow make the threat within it more real. The second sign came when he ran into the same senior aide of his father's at a reception. The man had greeted him warmly, but with an undertone of unease. Midway through their brief conversation, the aide had said something strange. "Sometimes the truth comes when you least want it. Be ready to receive it." At the time, William had assumed it was a philosophical comment about the pressures of public life. Now, he wondered if it had been a warning. When the envelope finally arrived, it carried none of the formal trappings of official royal correspondence. There was no courier in uniform, no palace stamp. It was delivered by a young staff member who seemed unaware of its significance. William had thanked him casually, setting the envelope aside until he was alone. But from the moment it touched his desk, he had felt a quiet unease he couldn't quite explain. The realization that this routine test had been orchestrated outside normal palace procedures led to darker questions. Who had ordered it? Who had access to the results before him? And, perhaps most troubling of all, who had chosen this particular moment to place them in his hands? It was possible the entire process had been designed to bypass any chance for the results to be intercepted or softened before reaching him. If that was true, then someone wanted him to know exactly what the document said, without interference. It left him with an unsettling thought. The DNA test had not been an accident, nor a mere health precaution. It had been a targeted action, deliberate and calculated. And if that were the case, then he was no longer just a participant in this revelation. He was the intended recipient of a truth someone had waited a very long time for him to confront. The envelope had barely settled on his desk when the first shadow of danger appeared. William had thought, for a fleeting moment, that whatever this truth was, it might remain confined to the walls of his study, contained between himself and the few who would inevitably need to know. But within hours of receiving it, the reality became painfully clear. Someone else knew, and they were prepared to use that knowledge. It started with a phone call. The number was blocked, the voice distorted, low and deliberate. The caller didn't introduce themselves, didn't waste time with threats in the traditional sense. They simply said, "If you don't deal with what's in that envelope, the world will deal with it for you." The line went dead before William could respond. The weight of the words pressed on him. They confirmed what he had feared. This was not a private matter anymore. Whoever was on the other end of that call had access to the information. It meant that the test results had not traveled through the secure, sealed path he had been promised. Somewhere along the chain of custody, someone had intercepted them, and now that person was holding a match to the fuse. By the end of the day, a second sign of danger arrived, not by phone, but in the form of a package left at the palace's side entrance. Security intercepted it, as they did with anything unscheduled, and it was brought to him after being screened. Inside was a plain USB drive, no markings, no note. Against his instincts, he plugged it into a secure, offline device used for sensitive materials. The contents were devastating. A digital copy of the full report, accompanied by photographs of it laid out in what appeared to be a newsroom. The implication was clear. This could be in the hands of the media at any moment. William sat back, staring at the screen, his pulse pounding. The message didn't need to be written. It was embedded in the images themselves. Someone wanted him to understand they had the power to release the information whenever they chose. They hadn't yet, which meant they wanted something in return for their silence. But the absence of a demand was more unsettling than the presence of one. It left him in a state of constant anticipation, waiting for the moment the trap would spring. Later that night, as he prepared to leave the palace for a private dinner, he was intercepted by one of his closest security officers, a man who had been with him for years and whose discretion was beyond question. The officer spoke quietly, glancing around to ensure no one else could hear. "Sir, we've picked up unusual movement online," he said. "Certain accounts on private forums are hinting at a story involving you and the Queen. The language is vague, but they seem to think they have something explosive." It was exactly the sort of early ripple that often preceded a full-scale leak. In his experience, such things began as whispers on obscure sites before making their way to journalists with connections. The fact that it was already being discussed in certain corners of the internet meant the clock was ticking. That night at dinner, he barely touched his food. His mind was consumed with questions. Who had set this in motion? Was it someone inside the palace, someone with a personal grudge, or perhaps someone outside with political motivations. The possibilities were endless. The monarchy was not without enemies, and a revelation of this scale would serve as the perfect weapon for anyone who wished to undermine it. In the days that followed, the pressure mounted. Anonymous emails began to appear in his private inbox, each one containing a single line. The first read, "You can't protect everyone from the truth." The second, "Your silence will make it worse." The third, "Tick-tock." The pattern was unmistakable. Someone was building psychological pressure, trying to push him into action before they acted themselves. He considered telling his father immediately, but something held him back. If Charles didn't already know the results had been intercepted, informing him would drag the king into a crisis with no clear solution. And if Charles did know, then his silence meant something far more troubling. Kate noticed the change in him almost immediately. He was quieter, more distracted, his phone always within reach even during moments that were supposed to be private. She asked once, directly, what was wrong, but he gave her the kind of answer he knew she wouldn't believe. "It's nothing urgent." He wasn't ready to bring her into this storm, not when the situation was still so volatile. One evening, while reviewing his schedule for the week ahead, he received another blocked call. This time the voice was different, calm, almost polite. "We don't want to hurt you," the caller said. "But the truth has value. If you don't control it, someone else will. Think about how the public will react when they see this without your voice attached to it." The line went dead again, leaving him in the same suffocating silence as before. He understood now that the threat was not a bluff. Whoever this was, they were not trying to negotiate. They were preparing him for inevitability. And that inevitability was fast approaching. Every day that passed without the leak breaking felt like a gift and a curse. It gave him more time to prepare, but it also deepened the dread of knowing that the story's eruption was not a matter of if, but when. The palace had always been a place of ceremony for William, a backdrop to formalities, obligations, and carefully orchestrated interactions. But that night, as he walked through the long, dimly lit corridor toward his father's private study, it felt more like enemy ground. The results were still fresh in his mind, and the recent threats had turned the air around him electric with tension. Every footstep echoed too loudly. Every shadow seemed to lean in, as though the very walls knew what was about to unfold. He had not requested an appointment through the usual channels. No aides were informed, no notes exchanged. Instead, he had sent a short, direct message to his father's private line earlier that evening. "I need to speak to you tonight. Alone." There had been no reply, but he knew his father had received it. Charles was meticulous about such things. When he arrived at the heavy oak door, he paused, his hand resting on the brass handle. He could hear the faint scratch of a pen inside, the occasional shift of paper. He knocked once, firmly, and waited. A pause, then his father's voice, low and measured. "Come in." The study was warm, the air faintly scented with wood smoke from the fireplace. Charles sat behind his desk, spectacles perched on the end of his nose, a half-finished letter before him. He looked up, and in that instant William saw something he hadn't expected: wariness. It flickered across his father's face for just a moment before being replaced by the usual guarded composure. "William," Charles said, leaning back slightly in his chair. "This seems urgent." William closed the door behind him and remained standing, his arms folded. "I received something today. Something that concerns you and Camilla." His voice was steady, but inside his chest his heart was pounding hard enough that he could feel it in his throat. Charles's gaze sharpened. "Go on." William moved closer, stopping at the edge of the desk. "A DNA report. My DNA. It says you and Camilla are my biological parents." He let the words hang in the air, watching for any reaction, any betrayal in his father's eyes. For a moment, Charles didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on William's face, searching, measuring. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost too quiet. "And you believe this?" "I didn't come here for belief," William replied. "I came here for the truth." The silence that followed was heavy. Charles removed his glasses and set them carefully on the desk, his hands folding over them. "You've had these results verified?" "They were verified before they reached me," William said. "And before you ask, yes, I've considered the possibility they were tampered with. But this wasn't an accident. Someone went to great lengths to make sure I saw them exactly as they are." Charles leaned back, his eyes narrowing slightly. And who else knows? Enough people that it won't stay contained for long, William answered. I've already had calls. Threats to release it. I need to hear from you, without evasions, what this means. For the first time in years, Charles looked away, his gaze drifting to the fire. The light from the flames played across his face, deepening the lines etched there by decades of public life. When he spoke again, his tone had shifted, less guarded, but tinged with something William couldn't quite read. You think this is easy to explain? Charles said. That the truth, if spoken plainly, would do anything but destroy what remains of this family. It's already destroying it, William shot back. You talk about duty, about service, about the crown. But what happens when the very thing you're protecting is built on a lie? Charles's jaw tightened. Be careful with your words. I've been careful my whole life, William said, his voice rising slightly. Careful not to question too much. Careful not to push where I shouldn't. But I can't be careful anymore, not with this. The tension between them was almost physical now, a palpable current in the air. Charles rose from his chair and walked to the window, his back to William. There are things you don't understand. Choices that were made long before you could have had any say in them. They weren't all mine to make. Then whose were they? William pressed. Charles was silent for a long moment. When he finally turned, his expression was unreadable. Camilla should be part of this conversation. Until then, I will say only this. Nothing you've read changes the fact that you are my son. In every way that matters. That's not an answer, William said, his voice flat. It's the only one you'll get tonight, Charles replied. His tone was final, but his eyes betrayed something else, something like regret, maybe even fear. William didn't move for a moment, holding his father's gaze. Then, without another word, he turned and left the study, the door closing behind him with a quiet click. As he walked back down the corridor, the conversation replayed in his mind. Charles hadn't denied it. He hadn't confirmed it either. But in the careful way he had chosen his words, William felt the weight of an unspoken truth pressing down harder than any outright admission. William knew there was no point in waiting. If he left the conversation with Camilla for another day, the pressure from the leak threat would only intensify, and she might hear about his confrontation with Charles from someone else. That would tilt the balance in her favor, giving her time to prepare answers crafted to deflect and dilute. He needed to see her without warning, to catch whatever truth existed in the raw moment before the guard of royal composure slid into place. He found her in one of the smaller drawing rooms of Clarence's house, a space she often used in the late afternoon when she wanted quiet. The fire was lit, throwing a soft orange glow across the room. A teacup rested on the table beside her, half finished, the steam still curling gently into the air. She was reading something in a slim leather-bound book, her glasses low on her nose. When she looked up and saw him, her expression shifted from mild surprise to something harder to read. Perhaps wariness, perhaps calculation. William, she said, closing the book and placing it beside her. This is unexpected. He stepped further into the room, closing the door behind him. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer without rehearsed lines, without the careful phrases you use in public. Camilla's brow lifted slightly, but she didn't object. Go on. I've received DNA results, William said, his voice steady though the words felt heavy in his mouth. They say you and my father are my biological parents. The silence that followed was different from Charles's. With Charles, the pause had felt defensive, a moment to weigh political cost. With Camilla, the pause was sharp, almost surgical. She seemed to be measuring him, not the situation. Her eyes didn't waver from his. And what do you think? She asked finally, her tone neutral. I'm not here to tell you what I think, William replied. I'm here to hear what you know. Camilla leaned back in her chair, her hands resting lightly in her lap. If I were to answer you outright, do you imagine it would make things easier for you? Or harder? That depends on whether you're more concerned about me or about the monarchy, William said. Something flickered in her expression, brief but unmistakable. It might have been the sting of truth. She reached for her tea, took a slow sip, and set the cup down carefully. William, the royal family has survived because it has always known what to share and what to keep locked away. Sometimes, protecting someone means letting them believe a version of events that will serve them better. That sounds like justification, he said. It's reality, she replied. Do you think your grandmother told everything she knew to everyone in this family? Do you think your mother told you everything she felt? Some truths are too heavy to hand to a child. And once you're no longer a child, the truth is so tangled in history and politics that it's almost impossible to give you the clean version you want. Then give me the tangled one, William said. Because I have people threatening to put it in the papers, and I'd rather hear it from you than read it as a headline. Camilla's gaze softened, though her voice remained controlled. You've always been more like Charles than you realize. Persistent, deliberate, unwilling to leave a question unanswered. But that's exactly why you must be careful. There are things about the past that, if dragged into the light, will do more than embarrass the monarchy. They will fracture it. I'm not asking you to protect the monarchy, William said. I'm asking you to tell me if it's true. Camilla looked at him for a long moment, then glanced toward the fire. I won't deny that Charles and I have a bond that spans far longer than the public record. But if you're asking me to give you a simple yes or no to a question that could dismantle the institution you're meant to inherit, no, I won't give you that tonight. That's not an answer, William said quietly. It's the only one I can give you without deciding your future for you, she replied. Because once you have that answer, you can't unknow it. And if you choose to act on it, the weight won't just be on your shoulders, it will be on your children's too. William felt a tightness in his chest, the same frustration he had left with after speaking to Charles. They had both avoided outright confirmation, but neither had denied it. That, in itself, was an answer. He turned toward the door, his voice low. If this story breaks before I have clarity, it won't just be the monarchy that's damaged. It will be all of us. And I won't be the one to shield it then. He left without waiting for her response. As he stepped back into the corridor, the cool air outside the drawing room hit him like a splash of cold water. The palace halls were as silent and orderly as ever, but to William, they felt like a labyrinth of secrets closing in around him. William had debated for days whether to involve his brother. Harry was an unpredictable factor in any crisis, especially now, with the distance, geographical and emotional, that had grown between them. But if the leak went public, Harry would be drawn into the maelstrom regardless, and William knew the narrative would be twisted to make it seem as though both brothers had been aware of the truth all along. Involving Harry early could either build an alliance or ignite a confrontation that would make things worse. He decided to take the risk. The call was arranged without palace intermediaries, using a secure line that bypassed official staff. When Harry answered, his tone was guarded but not hostile, the kind of clipped politeness that had become their default since his departure from royal duties. What's going on? Harry asked. William didn't waste time. I've received a DNA report. It says that Charles and Camilla are my biological parents. There was a silence so complete that William thought, for a moment, the line had gone dead. Then Harry spoke, his voice low and deliberate. You're serious? I wouldn't be calling if I wasn't, William said. And before you ask, it's been verified. Multiple times. Harry exhaled slowly. And you're telling me this now, because? Because it's not going to stay private, William replied. There's a leak threat. Someone has copies of the report, and they're already hinting about it online. I need to know if you've ever heard anything, that would make this less of a shock to you than it is to me. Another pause. There were rumors, Harry admitted. Years ago. Stuff whispered in the background. Nothing I could prove. I thought it was just another story the press made up to sell papers. Why didn't you tell me? William's voice was sharper than he intended. Because you would have dismissed it, Harry said. You've always been the one holding the line for the family. You wouldn't have wanted to hear it. William felt the truth of that like a sting. He had spent years defending the monarchy, not out of blind loyalty, but because he believed in its stability. Now that stability was crumbling in his own hands. Do you believe it now? William asked. Harry hesitated. I believe the results you've got are real. Whether the story behind them is that simple, I'm not so sure. If this is true, then someone has been covering it up for decades. And I doubt it was just Dad and Camilla keeping it quiet. There's a whole machinery built for this kind of thing. William leaned back in his chair, the phone pressed tightly to his ear. So you think it's bigger than them? I think it always is, Harry replied. You've seen how the palace works. If there's a truth they don't want out, they'll bend timelines, rewrite events, destroy documents, whatever it takes. The question is, why now? Why would someone want this to come out at this particular moment? The question had been haunting William since the envelope arrived. I don't know, he said. But if the leak happens, it won't just be about me. It'll drag Mum into it. It'll drag you into it. Harry's voice tightened. Then we need to be ready for that. But you also need to decide whose side you're on. If you go to ground and hide behind palace statements, you'll lose any chance of controlling the story. If you speak out, you risk everything, including your position. William knew Harry was right. The choice ahead of him was brutal. Protect the institution or protect the truth. I need to know you won't blindside me, William said. If the story hits, I need you to stick to one version, whatever that is. Harry gave a short, humorless laugh. That's rich, coming from you. But yes, I won't blindside you. Just don't expect me to defend the palace in this. My loyalty isn't to them anymore. The call ended with no sense of resolution. Only a mutual awareness that the ground beneath them was shifting. As William set the phone down, he realized that while Harry might not be an enemy in this, he was not entirely an ally either. They were bound by blood and history, but their paths had diverged so far that even in crisis, they were moving toward different destinations.